Welcome back to ESIP's Brief Take, where we take one issue and two or more points of view, this time with myself, David Henig, and my colleague Renata Zilli. And what a summer! Given daily US developments, we're going to take a step back and talk in general about dealing with the big three of trade, the US, EU and China. From London, the recently published UK trade strategy says we don't have to choose, and there were deals in May with both the US and EU. Even if these were frameworks more than detailed agreements, that was still something many had thought would not be possible. Renata is in Mexico. Hi. How would you see this question of choosing from where you're sat now?
Hi, David. Good to see you again. What a summer. Well, I think that question is not only interesting as is what everyone in trade is thinking about it, but also because it has different answers depending on who you ask. If you're a diplomat, regardless of which country you are from, you probably will have to give a nuanced answer and say something like, oh yeah, trade is important with all countries. But since we're not diplomats and I am in Mexico, I can confidently say that sometimes you do need to choose. In Mexico, for instance, we made that decision more than 30 years ago when we joined NAFTA to become an integrated region with the US and Canada. Of course, with a caveat that it's always hard to provide a simple answer to a complex phenomenon since supply chains and digital trade span throughout the world. But I also believe that we're living in a very pragmatic world. And how are things for you? I believe the UK has always struggled to answer that question. Which is most important, the US or the EU?
We're a North Atlantic economy, so both. And to your point on diplomats, actually ours are probably more experienced in dealing with Washington than Brussels. But on trade, this government has actually been clear that the EU comes first, followed by the US, with China very much third. So we're going to align goods regulations with the EU in many areas, but probably not so much on services beyond data, given the importance of the US there. And we'll try and pick up as much as we can on trade with China, though scarcely to the extent of that being a key partner. Interestingly, we had an audit of links with China, which showed continuing tension between our security and prosperity goals, which I suspect is not going to be resolved anytime soon. And even the last UK government flinched when faced with the possibility of having a no-deal Brexit, as the EU guessed it would. And in an area like data autonomy, it chose to put this ahead of regulatory autonomy. So gravity is still fundamental for trade, I think. But one thing less clear to me is how the US are demanding that its partners go with regard to their ties with China, whether that's for security reasons or because they think we should all buy more from the US. So far, it's not been much in the UK, but I think you're more in the firing line. So how's Mexico balancing the big neighbour and its challenger?
Indeed, the US exerting a lot of pressure to Mexico and China as their immediate trading partners to take a strong stance against China. However, I think it's important to mention that while China is always at the back of the head of Trump's trade agenda, it's not the only motivation behind Trump's tariffs to its North American partners. In contrast with other regions in the world, here we're seeing a combination of border security issues, organized crime, fentanyl trade, and labor standards all packed in the same agenda. This is what makes negotiations very complex. You're cross-pollinating different agendas and creating new outcomes as well as new problems that didn't exist before. Which takes me back to your China question. We know that relocating manufacturing to the US not only will take time, but it will also be very costly. There's a 90-day truce between an additional 3% tariffs to Mexico's imports. Canada was hit with 35%. And imagine this, the value of monthly US imports from these two countries is like importing two European unions. Of course, this is not feasible for that amount of tariffs. The issue here is that Trump faces an impossible trilemma. You can't at the same time become the factory of the world, having the dollar as a reserve currency and increasing tariffs from all over the world at the same time and expect to be competitive. Who will buy American after this? I think you should better buy North American. And leaving that open to see, I final question, what do you think this big tree means for global trade relations?
Well, I think it's important that if the US can't be the country it seems to want to be at the moment, or the workshop of the world, then clearly that's not a happy place, and that's a difficult country to deal with. But more broadly, the US-China policy seems far more ambiguous than some suggest, and this balance, if the US doesn't know its China policy and the EU is hovering in the middle somewhere, and then you've got mid-powers like the UK and Mexico, and plus the many other WTO members, there's really no basis there for much more than preserving world trade rules. And right now with US behavior, even that's a little bit of a stretch. We all have our national politics. We all have our economic needs. We have to trade with the big players. And unfortunately, that gives them more leeway to bend or break the rules. And coalitions of the willing are rather difficult when our companies need the business. So there's a lot of talk about a conversation involving CPTPP members and the EU, a kind of coalition of the willing for open trade and existing institutions. It's a great idea, but I don't think it'll solve the underlying issues. I think for the moment, survival is more the name of the game.
Sure. I actually was reading an op-ed in Mexico from one of the top trade experts, and he was exactly posing that same question. How come no one in this world has even suggested to give a coordinated response to Trump's threats? But how effective this could be also remains a big question mark. What we do know, though, is the type of world that we're in, of global trade, but with some players more powerful than others. We need more thinking about this and the post-Trump world, which I know you have started and will be doing more on this. In the meantime, thanks for listening and look out for more brief takes from eSite.
Thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.